Welcome back to your Thursday Buckeye Talk from cleveland.com. Doug Maurice and Nathan Baird. We're going 5 hours today. We went 3 on the last pod. Nathan, can we do it?
Yes, we will do it.
Okay. So I think we owe it to
We'll keep it under
people.
3 hours. You can keep talking at some point. I will not be here for 3 hours.
Nathan's going to live his life and eat his dinner and see his baby and his wife. So we're going to do a normal podcast today. As you guys know, this is my last week at cleveland.com. It's my last week on Buckeye Talk. Go back and listen to the gigantic cry fest that I dropped on Wednesday. Nathan and I want to talk about, what's the thing that we call it? Football. Because Nathan, I think we need to discuss, I want to get sort of on the record on this, in this place, you and Steven and anybody else that's going to be on Buckeye Talk going forward, because of course this pod and the Ohio State coverage at cleveland.com will live on and flourish, have plenty of time to talk about this. So we're not marking anything down. It's not mark it down last week stuff, but it's a discussion about Ohio State and the national title. And it's a discussion of, what do they have to overcome to have a chance to do this? And I am interested primarily, and I can't remember. I'm officially just all over the place this week because I'm doing things as I'm leaving cleveland.com. I'm doing things as I'm preparing to go somewhere else. I'm still doing my job. So my head's all over the place. I can't remember, did we just do a thing about Ohio State national championship chances and whether the things holding them back would be more internal or external? Did we do that? No, Steven and I did the threats thing, right?
Yes.
And that
Yes.
was a discussion of some specific things. Some were internal, some were external. Aha, that. Did you listen to that one?
I didn't.
Okay, that's okay. I'm
I
going to listen
probably
to you
will
guys
at some
when I'm
point.
gone.
I have
That's
not
okay.
yet.
That's okay. It's okay. So that's where that came up. Internal and external threats to Ohio State. Hey, what if they lose something? What if they don't do something well? Versus, hey, what if another team does something well that prevents Ohio State from getting where they want to go? I want to have a version of that discussion specifically about this team, Nathan. And when we think about it, what is it that are the things on the list that Ohio State has to take care of to have a chance this year? So we're not going to conclude, are they going to win the national title? You and I are not going to make a national championship prediction, even though on our final college football survivor show, Shahan and I did do that. So you guys, maybe I will make a prediction because I don't want to only do it there. I'll just tell you, Shahan picked Ohio State to win the national title this year. I gave it away. I just drove the ratings for the final. The college football survivor show actually might live on as well. Just won't have me on it. Just drove the ratings for that right through the basement. Everyone's like, well, that's the big reveal at the end. And Doug just gave it away on Buckeye Talk.
You should have just said someone picked Ohio State to win the national championship. They'd at least have to listen to find out who. Now they have to listen to find out who you picked, though.
I know, but I think I'm going to give that away too. But maybe not right now. So the point is this. I've covered 18 seasons of Ohio State football. In one of them, they won the national championship. And another one, they had no chance to win the national championship because their season exploded. So the other 16 years, the categories I made, Nathan, were internal flaws, something that they didn't do well enough that really was a primary reason why they didn't win the national championship. Another category was opponents, somebody they played. I didn't get theoretical on the opponents very much. I didn't say well, even if they had made the national title game, they weren't beating Deshaun Watson that year. You know what I mean? I kind of stuck to the things they actually faced. And then the other category was sort of luck, injuries, things that are honestly outside of their control that really had an impact on their national title hopes. And so in no year did I check off all 3 boxes. In many years, I did check off 2 of the 3. And in some of the years, I only checked off 1. So we're going to have a discussion along those lines. Let me ask you, do you think in totality in those 16 seasons that I checked off more internal flaws? There was just something about the team that wasn't good enough, or more external, they just ran into an opponent that stood in their way? What do you think I felt has happened more often since I started covering the team in 2005?
That's a great question, because I think I would say just in the playoff era, it's definitely been internal. Prior to that, though, where you're talking about the end of the Tressel era, converting into the first years of the Meyer era, I that might not be the case. So I'm trying to think of in totality though. In totality, I would say maybe you checked off more internal because I think it has just been more frequent that, especially just these last couple years, it's really that has really been hit hard. I think.
So one of the things is if I felt like there was an internal thing that derailed you, that prevented you from even getting to Bama, that prevented you from even getting to Clemson, then I didn't
Right.
mark down external for that. So
Right.
internal may have precluded you from having an external. So internal was more. In the
Yes.
16 years, I wound up with 12 out of 16 had something internal. 8 out of 16 had something external, and 3 out of 16 had something related to luck, injuries, sanctions, things that kind of wasn't their fault. So, why don't we start with since you've been on the beat and we can discuss 19, 20, 21, 22, and then I'll go back in the history books a little bit and then we'll dive into what we think about 2023. So let's start with 2019. We've done versions of this as we've talked about sort of national championship things, as we've talked about, some retalkables things and just like different, like the crushing losses, right? That's where you and I had a big discussion about this, the losses you would change. So in 19, I don't want to get bogged down in, you know, LSU was waiting there, whatever, I don't know. But like just like if you were making this chart for 2019, your first year on the beat, would you check internal? Would you check an external team? Would you check luck, injuries, kind of stuff like that? Or would you check multiple?
I would check external team, I suppose, but not Clemson, the team that they lost to. Really, there was nothing standing between that team and getting it shot to win a national championship. It just didn't win that semifinal game. It was just one of those results that happened. But I think if you were to look at it on paper, you would say LSU probably wasn't losing to anybody that year. So even if they'd gotten to play LSU, they were probably going to be the runner-up.
And I did feel like that Ohio State team in 2019 had something that was like, I don't know. Now in that moment, did they not convert enough in the red zone? Did the shot you could throw in the Shaun Wade targeting
I
potentially if you wanted to? You don't. We're not going to have another targeting discussion because that's not you are in control of whether you lower your head when you make a tackle to some
Yes,
degree, right?
correct.
So that's a football play. I agree with you. Let's not throw that into the like, oh, let's say. So that's probably right. Would you consider anything though that there was a flaw in that 2019 team? Like in that individual game, yeah, it would have been good to execute a little bit better in the moment. But did you think there was something about that team that held them back?
No, I mean that's the best team. That's the best Ohio State team that I've seen since I've been here, and I think top to bottom, it's one of the most talented and most balanced in talent that Ohio State's really ever had. Right? I mean, you talk about how defensively proficient that team was, and how balanced it was on offense with so many passing weapons, yet also being so just a punishing ground attack. So no, I don't think I would say it was anything other than they probably weren't going to beat. I don't know anybody was going to beat LSU. They were probably the team that was most poised to be the best runner-up to LSU, if that's any kind of damning with faint praise or praising with faint damnation. I don't know. And then they just had a bad loss. They just had some bad execution at the wrong time.
And when they did have the moments when they didn't execute, they were playing a good team that took advantage of it. And Trevor
Yeah,
Lawrence started to run, and Clemson's talented, and Clemson made him pay.
even if you wanted to extend this to like compared to the teams that have come after that, the receiving talent was maybe a step below. Still, I mean, you had young Chris Olave and young Garrett Wilson, who were still Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson, and Austin Mack and Ben Victor got NFL opportunities. It wasn't like it was a wasteland in that room. So, I mean, that even if that was like the one thing you were trying to complain about, really, that was just a great team. That if it had existed a year earlier, um, and it could collectively like that might have been a national championship team.
So I agree with that. I did not mark down anything internal, and I did not mark down anything luck or injury related. I just said external, Clemson, LSU, however you want to think about that.
Yep.
So 2019, we agree it's external. 2020, COVID year, a little whacked out. They lose the national championship game to Bama. What would you check there? And this is a little more complicated, I think. I'll be curious. Well, go. Where would you, of
Well,
the three categories, what would you check?
I think you could say the external thing, because maybe that Bama team was just a monster that wasn't going to be beaten. How much you want to also check a box for COVID, I think it's fair, but everybody to some extent dealt with it. I think it's, though, the box you would check would maybe not be COVID, it would be the Big Ten response to COVID. That ultimately, they had to play a shorter season. Things were a lot more disjointed for Ohio State than they were for Alabama or even for Clemson, who they beat in the playoff semifinal. And it cost them players down the stretch in a way that it wasn't costing Alabama players in the national championship game. So I think it would be fair, even though it was something everybody had to deal with, I think it's fair to check that box.
I don't think that if COVID never happened, Ohio State would have won the national championship that year.
Exactly. Right.
So I think you could check COVID. I didn't put a separate global pandemic box, but like in the big lump of like crazy
That's
stuff
almost luck.
happened, I think you could check it. I think you make a compelling case for checking it. I didn't. So let me ask you this. Would you check a flaw? Would you look at the 2020 defense and be like, man, that wasn't good enough? That was at least to some degree on them, their own failure.
Yes, there were definite cracks that we could have pinpointed early in that team's pass defense. They definitely missed the pass rush absence that once Chase Young left, nobody really filled that void. And then the secondary was sort of the beginning of a pretty bad downturn that kind of extended into 2021, obviously. So I think you would say that there were internal flaws that were, especially considering who they were going to play, was going to keep them from being able to win a national championship, even though you would point to the defense being pretty good actually against Clemson, and one of the reasons why they won that game so convincingly.
I only checked opponent. I only checked that like Bama was too good because they got there and they sort of survived their shortcomings on defense for much of the year anyway. I think there are compelling cases for the other ones. Do you think I'm wrong if I only check external opponent for 2020?
No, because that offense actually was so good, although it didn't really show up against Alabama when it had to. That was a big factor of why that game went the way it did. But if you take away the monster Alabama and replace it with even some other Alabama team from the Saban era, maybe even one that has won a national championship, I think that game is a lot closer. It's more competitive. It's a game that Ohio State could win. So I think it kind of goes back to what you were saying before. Sometimes it could be multiple things, but if one thing if one thing is true, then you don't need to check the other boxes.
Okay. So in 19 and 20, I checked just the external opponent. Ohio State wasn't perfect, but it didn't feel like quite the same as like there's just something blowing a hole in their chances. 2021, the early loss to Oregon, then the loss at Michigan. I checked two things here. I checked an external opponent in Michigan, that Michigan's good. And it doesn't mean that Michigan was unbeatable, but it wasn't like Ohio State just laid an egg. Michigan also took that game from Ohio State. So I think you have to check that. And then I also did check an internal flaw here, and I did check the defense. When you end up demoting the defensive coordinator in the middle of the year, and you have that game against Tulsa where the defense still can't stop anybody, and you just feel like a whole side of the ball is on uncertain footing for the whole season. It felt like, I don't know, like this could be a thing coupled with a really good opponent, but also Ohio State was doing it to itself. So that's how I looked at 2021. What do you think of it?
No, you have to check internal, and I think you could make an argument for whether you would only check internal, because if the defense is in a better position to start that year, maybe they don't lose to Oregon, and even if they lose to Michigan, are they still in a compelling place to argue for playoff inclusion? Do they get the two Big Ten teams in a year earlier than they did? I think you could make that case. And but at the same time, I also don't know revisionist history. Like, what would you have done? Would you have fired Kerry Combs coming off of the national championship game? Like, I don't think that was the way to go either. That was just one of those things that I think they tried to fix it and just didn't get it fixed in time. So they had to do as best they could on the fly.
So we'll both definitely agree there was an internal thing in 21. And then I think depending how you want to view Michigan and some of the circumstances, we both agree Michigan's good. But was it really more about the internal thing and Michigan isn't quite Bama or LSU we're talking about? So I did check both. I did check Michigan external as well. But I think there's a conversation there. 2022, what would you check? Internal, external, and then the luck, injury, intangible kind of box.
I think you would have to check luck, injury, and tangible, and because of how things played out in the national championship game, because it's going to be one of the great what ifs if they have healthy running backs, if they have Marvin Harrison Jr. for the second half, if they have Cade Stover for the final three quarters. Any one of those things changes the complexion of a one-loss game a lot. I don't think there was anything systemic that this team couldn't overcome, because obviously it was right there. They're 1 point away from being Georgia, and everyone kind of agrees outside of Texas that if they had won that game, they were going to be the favorite to win the national championship, and probably would have. There was nobody that was unbeatable. Even Michigan wasn't unbeatable for Ohio State. That was just one of those games that, again, didn't go the right way.
So it's interesting. This is Georgia. This is two-time national champion Georgia. And you and I agree there's not an opponent thing in 2022. There is not a team that you go, well, I don't know what they're supposed to do. What could Ohio State have done? We say that about Georgia because we know what they could have done. They were right there. So this is one of the three in the 16 years where I have luck and injuries, which we've all covered, which is Cade Stover trying to hurdle and getting flipped and leaving the game and winding up in a hospital, which is Marvin Harrison Jr. not playing in the fourth quarter after a play that maybe could have been called targeting, maybe not, but it winds up Marvin Harrison Jr. is out for the game, and that's huge. On top of Mayan Williams tries but can't really go. Trevion Henderson is out. They're just missing so many people. And we've talked about that a lot. So I do think that's absolutely one that you check. I did also check an internal box, though. I did not check an external box. But for 2022, I also checked the defensive breakdowns that they had against Michigan and Georgia that are just like, what is happening there? Coupled with I don't think, put themselves in a position to play their best game against Michigan in the regular season. I think there was the stuff that Ryan Day has talked about that we've covered on this podcast, that I do think there's a version of Ohio State that can beat that Michigan team and didn't. And Ohio State itself is responsible for some of the reasons why it didn't happen. So for 2022, I checked two of the three. I checked the internal flaw and the injury luck component, but I did not check opponent. Would you disagree with checking the internal flaw in 2022?
Yeah, I think I would, just because I don't think, as much as there was a clear issue with the explosive touchdowns. In the Michigan game, that was kind of inflated by the fact that the offense didn't do anything in the second half. And you can't say there was a systemic problem all season with the offense because of what it did production-wise all year and what it did production-wise against Georgia. I think that if you could, I suppose, maybe, and this gets back to an argument that you and I have sort of had in passing about how much there was an internal sort of mental block just about the Michigan game. And if you want to take it that far, to say there was either within the locker room, within the coaching staff, collectively, there was a glitch. There was a glitch in the matrix, whatever, that everything wasn't firing the way it was supposed to for that game. I suppose I could see that, but losing that game wasn't what prevented them from winning a national championship either. Like, they were still in the playoff. They still were head to head with Georgia. So I think I would still lean towards just checking the one box that nothing was holding them back. Um, all of the characteristics that you would want of a national championship team were there, and most of them got displayed on the field against Georgia. I mean, yes, they gave up some big touchdowns. They also got some big touchdowns against a really good defense. Like, at that level, there's going to be some back and forth there.
So we're in a world then where in your 4 seasons covering Ohio State, you would say in 3 of the 4 years, there was not something internal on the team that prevented them from being a national championship team. The 1 year is the year when the defense is enough of a problem. The cornerback play is a problem. Joe Moorhead, the Oregon offensive coordinator, takes advantage of it early on. It leads to a coordinator change. It's unusual. I actually don't know this answer. How often a play caller on either side of the ball has been changed midseason in Ohio State history. I cannot imagine it's very frequent. So that tells you right there. So definitively 21, there's something wrong. But 19, 20, 22, you and I debated 22. For the most part, this team in the last 4 seasons, as we're getting ready to discuss this for 2023, has on its own, in a vacuum, with normal luck and injuries, been there, been ready, been as good as it needed to be a national championship team. Does that surprise you that that's what we're determining here? Or are you like, no, I'm aware of my own surroundings. I've been covering this team. I know they're good. What are you talking about?
Well, no, I mean, I think that 1 month period, or however long it was, between the Michigan game and the Georgia game is what defines this team coming into this next year. It was clearly, for whatever reason, couldn't put it on the field against Michigan, but figured some things out, even in a compromised way. I mean, not having Henderson, having a very limited Mayan Williams, some other things go wrong even coming into that game. They figured enough out that they could then go toe to toe with the team that was going to win it all, had won it all themselves the year before. So I think that is what I'm most eager to see about this team. And there's some big differences. Obviously, you're changing the quarterback, and it's a person that hasn't been in that situation before that's going to now have to lead this team back there. That's a huge difference, and maybe that's enough of an X factor that this isn't a fair comparison. But everything else you're saying is true, that this is largely the nucleus of a team that was 1 point away from being the de facto national champion when you look at it in retrospect. And that should probably mean something into how they approach this season. There should be some self-confidence in the fact that they were right there on the precipice, and that one break here or there goes their way. They're the ones that have the storybook ending. And it should also mean something just in terms of the experience that they went through last year and the lessons learned that they now get to try to carry into this year. And I mean that as much for Ryan Day as I do for the 85th guy on the roster.
Okay, I'm going to run through the other pre-Nathan Baird years and just give you a quick look, but I'm going to do that at the end. Let's dig into this team. What we think could be the things in 2023 that do or don't exist. We'll do that next on Buckeye Talk.